Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. My name is Steve Denning. I'm coming to you today from Washington, D.C. Happy to be with you in this important conference about emerging from the crisis. I have to admit, though, that I have a problem with the topic of emerging from the crisis. For one thing, here in the United States, we are not anywhere near emerging from the crisis. At best, we are in the middle of it, maybe even still at the beginning of the crisis. For another thing, we are not dealing with a single crisis. We are dealing with multiple interlocking crises. We have a health crisis and an economic crisis and a crisis of racial inequality. As to health, it's hard to be optimistic about the health crisis in the U.S. ending anytime soon. It shows no sign of going away. Already more than 100,000 people have died. The virus is still spreading. Businesses are reopening, and control measures are being relaxed. With no vaccine and no treatment anytime soon, the health crisis is not going away. In the U.S., remedial measures for dealing with the disease were only partially effective. In the global ranking of country performance in handling the crisis, the U.S. ranks number 58, just after Romania and before the Slovak Republic, a truly humbling result for the world's most advanced economy. The need for greater agility in handling health crises is staring us in the face. On the economic front, more than 30 million people have lost their jobs, and the U.S. economy is in deep recession or even a depression. Despite massive government assistance and remarkably agile actions by the Federal Reserve, millions of small businesses are still at risk. Frustration is running high. Yet, amid these three ongoing, interlocking crises, we have one possible bright spot. The stock market seems to be living in an alternate universe. It is brimming with optimism. All it can see is sunshine and blue sky. After a brief decline, indices have jumped back up and now have reached new highs. The gains have been driven by the big five tech firms, which are now the most valuable firms on the planet. It's difficult to grasp how valuable they have become. Together, they are now worth more than $5 trillion. That's a quarter of the United States economy. Just two of them are worth more than the entire stock market of the United Kingdom. It's not always recognized that these market-leading firms have a common characteristic. They embody recognizably agile principles, even though they might express it in different language. By and large, they observe the three basic principles of Agile: obsessing over value to customers, working mainly in small self-organizing teams, and they operate as networks of competence rather than top-down hierarchies. It's also worth noting that these firms have become more valuable than any firms in the history of the world. They are valuable despite the grave crisis of the economy. In fact, they have become more valuable because of the crisis. In a crisis, agility is highly valuable. Agility is not the only reason they are valuable, but agility is a key enabler. If you've ever wondered whether agility could make money, just look at these five firms. Some say that these firms are valuable because the big five are all big tech. They are technology firms. Yet take a look at some other big tech firms like IBM and GE, which used to be market leaders and which heavily invested in technology. They haven't embraced agile principles, and they have gone into decline. Again, that wasn't the only reason, but it was a key enabler. Agile principles are increasingly recognized by the C-suite and leading management journals. In effect, the role that Agile itself plays in the world has changed fundamentally. In 2001, Agile was a set of ideas initiated by a bunch of unhappy software developers. They were unhappy because managers kept getting in the way. They wanted to get on with their work, making great software for their customers. They wanted managers out of their hair. By 2020, something strange had happened. The managers embraced strange new ideas that had begun in software. In effect, agile thinking had taken over their enemy. Agile had entered the mainstream of management itself and has become the default way for smart managers to lead even the largest organizations in the world. This is not just scaling agile practices within management. Now, agile practices have become practices of management itself. In Wall Street's terminology, Agile has carried out an effective takeover bid of management. In short, Agile is eating the world. However, this isn't a time for complacency or celebration. It's a time to rethink Agile's basic assumptions, taking stock of what's happened and preparing ourselves to meet future crises and challenges. There are at least 10 important areas where Agile needs to be rethought. They fall into 3 clusters. 4 concern the very concept of business agility, 4 concern the process of business agility, and 2 concern the diseases of business agility. Let's start with rethinking the concept of Agile. The Agile community, including me, has insisted for a long time that success in Agile depends on an Agile mindset to become part of the theology of Agile. I'm now beginning to wonder whether this was wise. It may have been a linguistic mistake. It's not a substantive mistake, but maybe a choice of an ineffective terminology. For one thing, there's little agreement among Agilists as to what Agile mindset means. Answers include, you know it when you see it, or the 4 values of the manifesto, or Carol Dweck's growth mindset. None of those really get the job done. For outsiders, insistence on the Agile mindset makes Agile seem nebulous or mystifying or something like a cult. I've found it to be a big problem in disseminating Agile thinking outside the community. So here's a thought. Here's my hypothesis. What if we put less stress on the Agile mindset and instead put more stress on Agile principles? The concept of principles was popularized by Ray Dalio's book, Principles. Principles are like guiding rules of conduct. In religion, they're like the 10 commandments of the Old Testament or the 2 principles of the New Testament, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. They guide conduct. They don't answer all questions, but they point to where the answer may lie. The advantage of principles over mindset is that principles can be discussed in a way that mindset can't. It's not that mindset is wrong. It's just that mindset is more obscure and confusing than a set of specific principles. If we talk about mindset, it's hard to argue about what it is. When we talk about principles, we can discuss what the Agile principles actually are and whether they're correctly formulated. The number of principles needs to be very small. As a start, I've suggested only 3: the principle of the customer, the principle of the small team, and the principle of the network. My hypothesis is that it would be easier to communicate Agile with a small set of specific Agile principles than with an all-or-nothing Agile mindset. What do you think? Here's a second area where I think we need to push the concept of what we mean by agility. It's the question of strategy. Over the last 2 decades, Agile practices have mainly focused on what I've called operational agility. That is to say, making existing products better for existing customers. That's good as far as it goes, but does it go far enough? As the coronavirus crisis has shown in undermining many business models, a truly Agile firm must be able to create new businesses. In effect, it has underlined the importance of what I've called strategic agility, creating new businesses for new customers. While strategic agility builds on operational agility, the practices of operational agility won't get the job done. They won't build new businesses. They were never intended to. Strategic agility requires radically different processes that relatively few Agile coaches know or understand. So here's my hypothesis. Strategic agility will become much more important over the coming years, more important than operational agility. Every executive and every Agile coach will have to understand and practice the processes of strategic agility. What do you think? Here's a third area. The principles of agility evolved in software development. We now have a rich shopping list of practices to do that, Agile in software. Most of the writing is about exactly that. There's not much written about agility in hardware, and practically nothing about how it's different from software. The assumptions are often that Agile in hardware is pretty much the same thing as Agile in software. Bytes are radically different from atoms. They have to be treated different. Failure to notice this can lead to the assumption that maybe Agile doesn't work in hardware at all. I don't think either assumption is right. Here's my hypothesis. We need more analysis and discussion of the differences between Agile in hardware and Agile in software. If we did that, we could build up a rich inventory of sound practices for doing Agile in hardware, just as we have it for Agile in software. This could draw on the work of pioneers in this field like Tesla and Haier and Volvo Cars. What do you think? Here's a fourth area. Most of the writing about Agile has also been about Agile management in the private sector. Some examples in the public sector already exist. Stan McChrystal's Team of Teams is one notable example. Mission Command in the U.S. Army is another. The Department of Defense is doing great work in this area. Here's my hypothesis. Suppose we spent time studying and explaining how the Agile enterprise in the public sector differs from that in the private sector. For one thing, in the public sector, there is often no customer in the normal sense. So what becomes of the principle of the customer? And public sector organizations have to deal with multiple political masters that affect things in ways that are quite different from the private sector. Here's my hypothesis. Suppose we documented and spelt out the implications of these differences. I believe this could shed light on areas where management is currently failing. For instance, the handling of the current coronavirus crisis, the education sector, and climate change. So those are four areas where the very concept of Agile needs rethinking: mindset, strategy, hardware, and public sector. If we follow those ideas, we will have a larger and richer notion of the meaning of the Agile enterprise. Let's turn now to areas where Agile processes need some kind of rethinking. This includes the role of the C-suite, the role of working face-to-face, the role of HR, and the role of budgeting. Let's start with the role of the C-suite. Here we need to recognize the history. Agile thinking and practices were developed through trial and error by workers at the base of the organization, not the top. Agile thinking gradually spread to the whole organization, so as eventually to create Agile enterprises. Yet there's still very little known about what the C-suite actually does in an Agile enterprise. We have some examples. We've got Jeff Bezos at Amazon. We've got Darryl Rigby's example in his great book, Doing Agile Right. And we also have the case of Kurt Carlson at SRI International. So here's a hypothesis. We need more examples of how an Agile C-suite actually operates so that we would have a whole array of successful processes and practices that could be shared with other organizations that don't have to invent these things from scratch. We would have those processes in the same way that we have them for software development. Then there's the whole question of working face-to-face. The theology of the Agile movement is that working face-to-face is better. During the crisis, we had lockdowns forced on us, and so vast numbers of people had to work from home. The firms that had already adopted Agile practices found this, often to their surprise, to be a remarkably easy transition. Working from home was not only possible, in many cases, it's better for the staff and for the organization. The benefits include massive savings, not just in travel time, but in better ways to get the work done. So here's my hypothesis. Suppose we rewrote the practices of Agile to reflect the fact that for many purposes, working virtually needs to become a permanent option. It turns out that it's a natural marriage, virtual work and Agile management principles. Strangely, books like Working Virtually read like textbooks on Agile management. So why not give it a try? Then let's turn to one of my old favorites, HR. Most discussions of HR for business agility focus on turning the traditional HR group into a team that adopts some of the practices of Agile software development. That may be a start, but it misses the point that traditional HR is an instrument of the bureaucracy. Its function is to administer the roles and rules of the bureaucracy in a smooth and efficient fashion at the behest of top management. As the name implies, HR treats people as resources, that is to say, things. Here's my hypothesis. First, people management function needs to be radically reinvented. We need to call people people and treat them as people. Second, we need to make the function an integral part of an organization obsessed with adding value to external customers, not to run an internally efficient machine. If we do that, it's likely that the role of the function will tend to resemble something like an agile coach. Those in that role will need to have an external focus and be equally obsessed with enabling staff to increase value to external customers as the be-all and end-all of the organization. The function should oversee and facilitate the relation of the staff member to the organization before, during, and after employment. What do you think? Let's turn to another old favorite. Budgeting in big organizations is a vast debacle. It's hugely expensive, unproductive, out of date by the time it's approved, serves as a constraint on innovation. Everyone knows it's horrible. The Beyond Budgeting Roundtable has been trying for some 20 years to find a solution. Only a few members have succeeded in the goal of abolishing the budget. The dilemma is that the annual budget is necessary to run the business, but seemingly impossible to reform. Here's my hypothesis. The reasons the budget is hard to reform is that we're looking in the wrong place. The problems of budgeting don't lie in the budget itself. They lie elsewhere in the organization. They reflect a failure to agree on the firm's goal. They reflect faction fights between layers and silos. Those aren't budget problems. In firms that have truly embraced a clear and pervasive obsession on the external customer and a strong planning process, my take is that budget isn't a problem. It becomes almost a mechanical matter of adding up the decisions already taken. So my conclusion is, if you want to fix the budget process, look beyond the budget process. The problems of budgeting are a symptom, not the disease. Okay, so those are 4 areas where processes need to be rethought. Let's turn to the diseases of the agile enterprise. Number 1, let's think about fake agile. What seems to have happened is that because of the popularity of agile management, many firms claim to be agile but are in fact agile in name only. Some instances of supposedly agile management have as much relation to real agile as someone wearing flamenco costumes and talking about flamenco and without having mastered flamenco dance steps or displaying a feel or flair for flamenco music. There are many forms of fake agile, including copy and paste agile, big bang agile, agile that doesn't make money, agile as a cult. The prevalence of fake agile risks discrediting genuine agile. It's like Gresham's law in economics. Bad money drives out the good. Bad agile drives out good agile. So here's my hypothesis. The problem of agile in name only is serious and needs to be addressed through clearer focus on specific agile principles, not through an all or nothing labeling of agile or not agile. Finally, let's take a quick look at the dark side of agile. This isn't much talked about in the agile community, although it's talked a lot about outside. As evangelists in agile, we naturally emphasize the strengths and the good things that agile does. But as agile becomes the mainstream of management, in fact, the mainstream of the most valuable firms on the planet, we need to face up more explicitly to the dark side of what agile leads to. We need to talk more about how agile firms become so successful that they quickly become monopolies. Some of them have slid into the abuses of power that come with monopolies, such as destroying competition and misusing customer data. Here's my hypothesis. We in the agile community should document and classify the various missteps that big tech is taking and show how they should be dealt with. What do you think? So there we are. That's the challenge in front of us. We need to rethink the very concept of the Agile enterprise. We need to rethink the processes of the Agile enterprise. And finally, we need to deal with the diseases of the Agile enterprise. I've offered you 10 hypotheses as to how to go about that. As resources, in my Forbes column, you'll find articles on all these subjects. And as some of you know, I am working on a new book about all of this. And as with my previous books, I'll be setting up a discussion group to review drafts as they emerge. If you'd like to participate in this discussion group, send me an email at steve@stevedenning.com. Let's get to work.